Right, well, good morning again. First up, we have Lisa and Fiona, our career consultants, who are going to give you some top tips on keeping positive and proactive in your job search in these uncertain times. So Lisa and Fiona, over to you.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. So good to be with you, albeit virtually today. The aim of the next kind of half an hour or so is to give you some top tips and help you prepare for job seeking in this environment. I'm sure that people are already in some kind of routine working from home. You know, the beginning was a bit kind of scary. We all didn't know what was right and what was wrong, how to do it. But I think people are starting to get into a routine with children, adapting to the new normal. But looking for a job in this environment is exactly the same. So creating that routine, whether it's solely focused on job seeking or whether it's structuring a job seeking routine around your working day if you're still working, getting that structure is very important, not just for your mental health, which obviously is paramount, but also for you to be productive. And what works for you might not work for someone else. So other people might tell you how they do it. If that doesn't sound right or ring true, it doesn't mean it has to work for you. So make it work for you. And, you know, as it says on the screen, be kind to yourself, lower expectations. You're probably not going to achieve as much in this type of environment as you would in, you know, the old, what used to be normal environment. So, you know, try and just achieve what you can and be proud of that. Communication really is very important. Obviously, we're not able to communicate as much face-to-face as we are used to, but technology is a marvelous thing. So keep on it with that, whether it's face-to-face in terms of on a video screen, or whether it's just on the phone or through email or chat. You know, just keep in touch with contacts. And, you know, we'll go through this in a bit more detail later, but, you know, really do need to make sure that you're properly set up for that kind of thing, and it's worth investing in that. And keeping your family in the loop, that means, you know, if you've got something important you need to focus on, just, you know, make sure they're aware and that they can support you in that. And then just a final couple of items on, you know, getting outdoors, getting a change of scene. That's going to be useful and helpful to for your mental health as well, and keeping in touch with those that you're worried about. I'll hand over to Fiona now.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual employment forum, as I hope you get a lot out of it. Anyway, information is power. There is no real precedent. The senior management team don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. Probably we all don't. So we just have to sort of make the best of what we've got. And for some, there will be opportunities, and it's just knowing the right place to look. I think the main thing is do your research and be prepared. A lot of you will be working at home. Possibly you will have more time, but maybe you won't because you're doing homeschooling and everything else. But you need to be ready for life after lockdown. You don't want to be caught on the back foot. So spend this time looking into possible career paths. And I've been talking to clients quite a lot about that the job that they get next might not be the one they thought they were going to get, because this was pre-pandemic, and it's looking into what career paths are available now. And Lisa will talk a bit more about who's hiring, which sectors are hiring. So therefore, understanding the employment landscape, how will work be in the future? You know, what is the shape of work going to be like? The other thing that you can do in this time is research qualifications. Lots of qualifications you can do online, for example, project management qualifications. So you may decide this is the perfect time to do it. And as I said, you know, focus on building your knowledge so that when things are a bit more normal, you can hit the ground running. There is plenty of knowledge out there, almost too much actually, in terms of the internet, the press, and so on. The other thing to do, and you can look this up on the government website, is look at which organisations value military skills and experience and have signed the Armed Forces Covenant. I think at least 3,000 companies have signed the Armed Forces Covenant. Some will be big, some will be small, some will be hiring, some won't be. So, for example, financial services have signed the armed forces government, all the organisations within that. But at the moment, they're not necessarily hiring a lot, whereas other companies, for example, like BT, may be hiring. But just do your research and make sure that you understand that.
Thanks, Fiona. Can I just add, for all those who aren't aware of military-friendly employers, a great place to start is our executive jobs board. So here we're posting roles with military-friendly employers who are actively seeking the skills and experiences of an officer.
Great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about knowing yourself and your skills. So I think most people, when they leave the military, frankly, don't know exactly what they want to do. Some people do. Those people are actually very rare. They might have a specialist skill such as telecoms, or they might be an engineer, or they might be an HR specialist, and they want to carry on doing that. But for those of you who are perhaps more generalist, the world is your oyster, and as Fiona touched on, there's a huge lot of information out there, and there's a huge lot of jobs out there and career options out there. So most people don't know exactly what they might want to do, and that's okay. You don't need to know what you want to do, but what you do need to know is yourself and what you're good at. So I think one of the best things you can do in this time, when we've got time on our hands, is just sit down and think about that. You know, who am I? What am I good at? And crucially, what do I want to do more of? And obviously what you kind of come up with there will form the backbone of your CV. And it's important to think about what makes you different and therefore valuable to an employer. Because a lot of military people talk about their leadership skills, which obviously are an excellent thing to offer an employer, but it's firstly unlikely that you'll go straight into a job unless you go in at some kind of CEO level where you're going to be employing those leadership skills. You're probably going to be learning something new and starting off at a level which means that you're not going to be leading. Probably important not to highlight the leadership. Equally, every military officer talks about leadership. So try and think, what do you offer that is key and that is different? And then secondly, is that obvious on your CV? So if you are fluent in French and Italian, have you put that on your CV? If you have got some unique experience working in reconstructing buildings with the UN in a remote location, you want to go into the construction industry, have you mentioned that on your CV? Is it really obvious? Most employers will only look at your CV and scan it for 5 to 10 seconds. So you need to get across the important information quite quickly. And if you want advice on your CV, please do come and seek that from the OA. We're really happy to help there. Somebody's just asked about leadership and asked why we wouldn't trumpet about that. I'm not saying it's not a good skill, of course it is, but if every single military person talks about leadership and nothing else, it's not going to differentiate you. So I'm not saying don't mention it, I'm just saying think about how you can differentiate yourself from other military people that might be going for the same job as you. Fiona touched on qualifications, and obviously now is a really good time to look at qualifications and, you know, make sure that you're getting the right ones to target the jobs you want. So for example, project management, there are a raft of different types of project management qualification. Which one is right for the type of organisation that you want to work for? And the way to do that is to speak to people and see what kind of project management qualification should I look at? Should I look at APMP? Should I look at Prince? Should I look at, Agile or something like that? Try and find out what would be the best and the most useful one for you to get. And look into your ELCs. This is money that you can spend to make yourself more marketable. And, look at what companies are looking for. Read job specs. If it says essential criteria must have qualification in X, then that's probably something that you need to look at gaining. If you want to work in HR at a certain level, you do need to have some kind of CIPD qualification. So therefore, it's going to be perhaps a good time for you to look at how to get that, what it's going to cost you, and the investment involved, and whether it's something you really want to invest in.
So also think about what is important to you, because in a way you are choosing a job and a company. It's not just them choosing you. So you can break it down into different things. And first of all, look at the culture and values of the company. So research, how much do companies walk the walk? Well, you can look at websites, but also probably the main thing to do is try and ask current employees. Now, obviously at the moment we can't do that face to face, but you can contact people through LinkedIn or through the Officers Association network contact list and ask them, what's it like working for BP? What's it like working for Amazon? What's it like working for Mighty or something like that? And I do often talk to clients and they've formed an opinion before they've often even talked to somebody. And I've heard clients say, well, I wouldn't want to work for Amazon, but they've actually never talked to anybody who works for Amazon. So keep an open mind and talk to people, and then sort of work out, do the values of that company match yours? Now, you may not have even really thought about what are your values, so you might want to sit down and actually write a list of values and what is important to you. In the commercial world, obviously making money is important, but you can look at the culture of the company and say, but do they make money in an ethical way, or so on. Quality of the people. What kind of people work in the company? Will they inspire you? Again, at the moment, you can't talk face to face to people, but quite often on company websites, they sort of highlight people who work for the company. So you could read up about those people. Again, talk to people through LinkedIn. Types of roles. What variety exists? So what you might want to do is think about the size of the company. Now, in a small company, there are probably fewer roles, but you get a chance to look at what goes on in the company at a fairly sort of top level, but there may not be much variety of roles. In a large company, obviously, there are going to be more jobs and there will be more opportunity for career progression and development. Also, what do these roles involve day to day? Quite often people say to me, well, I don't really understand what operations management is. Well, talk to an operations manager and find out, what is the day in the life like of an operations manager, say in Thames Water. Geography, how far are you willing to travel? I think this is really an important one, because people in the forces sometimes are very lucky in that they live in a quarter on the base and they've got a few minutes walk to work. Outside of the military, that's probably less I suppose less, not familiar. It's very few people are able to do that. And obviously we're all being encouraged to travel to work on a bike now, but for some people that's just going to be too long a journey. So look at, what is your limit of travel? You may have chosen to live in the countryside, which is lovely and beautiful, but how long would you have to take, say, to get into London or get to Bristol or so on? And just think about that. And what's the transport situation like? And also the cost of the transport if you're going by public transport. Finally, are you happy to spend a few days in a different location? I do talk to lots of people who say the reason they're leaving the forces is because they want to be at home every night. However, there may be some jobs, for example, consultancy, where you do have to spend time in different locations, and are you prepared to do that?
Yeah, so just kind of building on what Fiona said there about getting advice from people, I genuinely think that people are your best resource, and certainly in the military network that is out there is absolutely fantastic. Anyone with a military background is by and large really happy to talk to people, no matter who they are, whether they know them or not, whether they're a friend of a friend, or whether they just share the fact that they're an ex-military. So take advantage of that. Find people on LinkedIn. You can still build your network remotely, and in fact now is probably a good time to do that, so that, as has been mentioned earlier, when things ease up a bit, you can hit the ground running. and look for companies offering online events, attend those. You know, a lot of companies out there offering online events, and more often than not, where events have been quite selective in the past or restricted by numbers, having them online means that they're more open. So actually this is a really good time to learn about companies. Keep connecting to people on LinkedIn. You know, apparently the average person on LinkedIn is connected to around 350, 400 people. So, you know, if you think that you might need to connect to more people, then perhaps now's a good time. And it's not just a case of connecting people, you know, connecting to people in terms of badge collecting or boasting about how many people you're connecting with to, but, you know, connections breed connections. So the more people you're connected to, the greater your reach is going to be, and that's what counts. And think about the companies that interest you. So perhaps make a list and then try and target people within those organizations. Use the search field on LinkedIn. If you've got a mutual connection who knows somebody in an organization, ask them to introduce you. Virtual conversations are becoming more and more the norm. So use Skype, use Zoom, use WhatsApp video calls, any platform that you can, or even just a good old phone, just to chat to people, or if you prefer via email, that's absolutely fine. Just get in touch with people and learn as much as you can. Who knows what the landscape will look like in the future, but for now, I think this is a really good time for us to use the tools that we have, do our research, and really look into it. Someone's just asked about the premium service on LinkedIn. I mean, I personally don't have it, and I don't think that it's worth it. Lincoln Coots, who runs a LinkedIn workshop for us, also says the same thing. If you're connected to a large number of people, your reach is going to be absolutely fantastic, and the chances of having a second degree connection who works in an organisation that you are interested in or who can connect you is going to be quite high. So, I mean, the thing that premium offers is an ability to reach out to people and contact them, message them, you know, freely. But personally, I think it's better to do it via some kind of second level connection. So I mean, you can by all means look into the premium. You can get it free for a month, so why not do that? But I wouldn't say it's worth subscribing, but that's my personal view.
I would agree with you, Lisa. I mean, I think, you know, again, it's not just boasting how many connections you've got, but I've got over 500 connections, and more or less I can guarantee in any large company in the UK, I've got at least one second degree connection. So I don't use premium either.
Great. Well, thanks. I think that's all for this presentation.
Thank you, Fiona, Lisa. Just to reiterate the point on social media there, for those who missed it earlier, we have an online networking group on LinkedIn called OA Connect, which I really recommend everybody joining. Everyone there is either a former officer or a supportive employer, so you can reach out to them asking for advice or for help with connections. So if that's one key takeaway for today, I would go away and action that. So Lisa and Fiona, obviously both as career consultants, advise daily on how to approach interviews. But with so many organisations now recruiting remotely, it's important to be prepared for the online interview. So again, we've got some more advice from Fiona and Lisa, as well as Andy Brown from the Shaw Trust, about this new type of recruitment. So over to you again, ladies.
Thanks very much, Esme. Yeah, it's interesting because Lisa talked about virtual conversations being the norm now, and definitely virtual interviews have become the norm. But I also think going forward that some companies will certainly do part of their recruiting process online. They won't have face-to-face because it's very cost effective, or if the person's abroad, it's much easier. And again, I mentioned Amazon before. Speaking to Gemma Jones, who's the military recruiter for Amazon, she said even before the pandemic that Amazon did a lot of their recruiting online, and they're going to continue to do that. So be prepared, I think, is the answer. So which takes me very nicely onto this slide. Prepare, prepare, prepare. I can't really reiterate enough how much you need to prepare. And a little bit further on, we'll talk about preparing for the organisation, but I'm talking now about preparing yourself within the job. So first of all, consider the job itself. Read the job description carefully. If you haven't got a job description, then ask for it, and all good companies should be able to send you a detailed job description. So look at the job description, think about the things that where you've already had experience and what you can do. Also, use the person specification to identify the essential skills, experiences and competencies required for the role. And again, if you don't have a person specification, ask for one. As Lisa said earlier, generally a person specification would list essential skills and desirable skills. And it really is important that you have most of the essential skills. If you haven't got one or two of the essential skills, you might want to think about how are you working on those. So for example, commercial experience to gain experience, and then you can tell the interviewer. But the main thing is to come up with strong examples of how you fit the requirements. Also, as I said further down the list, use a variety of examples and situations. I remember talking to a client who felt he hadn't done very well at an interview, and I asked him, well, why was that? And he said, oh, I didn't give a wide enough variety of examples. He'd just come back from operational tour for 6 months, and he said all the examples he gave were from his last operational tour, whereas he should have actually given examples for the last few years of his time in the services. The main thing is, though, and I talk to people in CVs about this, is focus on what you did and the outcome or the value added as a result. A lot of people just list tasks and responsibilities, and that's fine, but you need to also talk about what was the outcome or value added of what you did. So, for example, if you, let's say, designed and delivered a training course, the outcome isn't that you did that. The outcome is what value did that add? What could people do at the end of the training course that they couldn't do before? So as I said, use a variety of examples and situations. Consider any challenges you've had. It's unlikely that in your career you've not had any challenges. And some of the challenges may have been in the things that are essential in the person specification. But be positive about how you put these across, and talk about how you overcame these, and also then think about what you have learned from these situations. So all the time being positive about any, let's say, challenges that you had and how you overcame them.
I just wanted to kind of touch on that last point, though, that which is think about what you learned from these situations. And a lot of people talk about the STAR technique of interviewing, and situation, task, action, result. But then adding an L on the end and talking about what you learned, I think employers are really impressed by that, because someone who's got a capacity to learn, no matter what level they're at, is always going to be someone attractive. And showing that you've learnt and you want to take that learning forward to benefit their organisation will really hit home.
Thanks, Lisa. That's a really good point.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so just a few words about interview etiquette. I mean, some of it, will probably be pretty obvious, and some of it, there's been a lot of jokes bandied about online recently about, people wearing their, being only clothed from the waist up and wearing their shorts or underpants or whatever underneath. Now, obviously, that's that sounds like a bit of a joke, but you just never know what might happen or how how things might pan out. You might be required to stand up at some point, so you don't want to put yourself in a dodgy situation. So we've got some things on the screen here about eye contact, body language. So eye contact, now you might be tempted to kind of look at the person's image on the screen when actually what you need to look at is your camera on your device, so that will make you look like you are looking directly at the person on the other side. And try and practice this, you know, practice it with friends and family. Use Skype, use FaceTime, use WhatsApp video call, whatever you want, but you know, practice it and ask, you know, get feedback from people. What did I look like? Was I looking directly at you? Did I have any annoying tics? Video yourself. It might sound a bit cringeworthy, but video yourself and then play it back. You know, do you say and a lot? Do you fiddle with your hair or your earring, or, you know, some kind of piece of jewelry? Do you scratch your nose? You know, all these things that you might do that you're perhaps not aware of, you'll pick up on when you watch yourself. I think listen is a really important point, because when you're interviewing, and in the absence of being able to create a real life rapport, try and listen really carefully to what the interviewer is saying. Equally, when the interviewer is talking, they might drop in a few top tips or little nuggets about the organisation that you can pick up on and then perhaps play back to them later. There's nothing wrong with taking notes during an interview either. So, you know, do that quite freely. You can perhaps say to the person on the other side of the screen, I'm going to be taking some notes. I hope that's okay. I mean, I think what it shows is that you're engaged, you're interested, but also that what they're saying is valuable. And I think that's flattering, and people will respond well to that. Remember to smile, because, you know, although it is a serious business, interviewing, and you want to make a good impression, if you're looking stressed or frankly downright pissed off, it is not going to put you across in a good way. And you know, I've said the last point here: practice, 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 and really you can't practice enough, and it'll help you iron out any little foibles you might have, but also it'll make you feel more comfortable talking about yourself and frankly selling yourself, selling the skills that you have and the experience that you have in a kind of easy way if you're familiar with talking about it. So, I mean, absolutely treating it as you would a face-to-face interview. And I think the advantage as well with practicing and testing, have a look at your environment. You know, we've seen a lot of people on the news, reporters kind of delivering their viewpoint, and kind of a bookcase seems to be quite a popular backdrop, or a plain wall, something that isn't busy and doesn't detract from you and from what you're saying. So, you know, try and keep the focus on you. Absolutely testing your IT, that kind of thing, you know, that's very important, and you know that will happen as you do your practicing. And really the etiquette in general is treat it absolutely as you would a real interview. So dress the part, prepare, you know, be ready, have lots of questions, and you know, make sure you've done your research, you know what the job is, you know yourself, and you know the organisation that you're targeting. Obvious things like turning off your phone, try and make sure that, you know, you're not going to get a small person running in saying, mummy, I need a wee, or something like that. You know, these kind of little things. I mean, there's an element where in this current environment, people might excuse them more than normal. And we've all seen that clip with the guy who had his children coming into the screen as he was delivering a report. But you know, if you can avoid that, it's probably better not to be remembered for that, but be remembered for the excellent content that you delivered during the interview.
Thanks. I touched on, or well, I more than touched, I sort of emphasised preparation when I first started talking. I'm now also going to talk about preparing for tough questions and the preparation that you need to do there. And one of the main things that you should look at is understanding the role and the organisation that you're applying to. Now, again, all of this is going to have to be done virtually, but there's plenty of information out there. You can go onto companies' websites. You can read either online or hard copy, things like the Financial Times, the Economist, the business pages of the Times. All of that will give you information about different companies and organisations, but also it will tell you about the market and what are the challenges in the market. Also understand the role. I talked about the person specification and the job description, and try and work out how that role fits into the company and what you'd be expected to contribute. And when you get to the interview, or you're doing it not face to face, virtually, make sure that you try and demonstrate this knowledge and research. Obviously, you don't want to come across as a sort of smart ass and somebody telling them how to run the company. But when you get the opportunity to ask questions, you might say, oh, I see you're researching into whatever it is, you know, how will this affect the company? What are the plans of the future, or something like that. With your questions, okay, it's maybe not possible to identify every question that you're going to get, but certainly a common question within interviews is, what are your strengths? And make sure that you can list those, and again give good examples of how you demonstrate your strengths. People also ask, what are your areas of weakness? And I would turn that on its head and say it's not a weakness, it's an area for development. So if you can put across in the interview that you recognize that you're not as experienced in this particular situation, or you find it more challenging, you can talk about what you're doing to develop that skill or that competency. Also, you may be asked to talk about your journey. In other words, how did you get to where you are in your career? So make sure that you can talk succinctly about that. And you also may be asked to describe a difficult situation. What happened? What did you do? And what was the result? So again, as Lisa said, the STAR: situation, task, action, result, and also what you learned from it. And then finally, have relevant questions to ask. We have heard people say, oh, well, I didn't get the chance to ask my questions. Hopefully the interviewers will at the end say, have you got any questions that you want to ask? And you don't want to ask questions like, well, how long will I get for a lunch break, or how many days holiday I get. You want to ask questions about, you know, what are future plans for the organization, the goals. It would be okay to ask, you know, what opportunities there are for development, but you want to be more focused on the organization rather than you yourself and the things that you can get from the job.
Sorry, Fiona, can I just jump in? We've had an excellent question, which I think will apply to quite a few people, but somebody said sometimes the really good answers come from very early in a long career. Is it wise to use an example from 10 or more years ago, or do you think you should be using a weaker answer from a more recent time?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Esme, for that. I don't know, I've got mixed views about this, because we always say to people, you only really need to go back 8 to 10 years in detail in a CV. And one of the main reasons is because technology changes so fast that what you did 10 years ago may not actually be relevant to what you're doing today. However, if the answer is more about maybe your management or leadership style, yes, you may want to use that example, and you don't necessarily need to say in the interview that was 10 years ago. You could just say, oh yes, well, I do remember a situation where I was doing this job, this is what happened, and this is how I dealt with it. So I would say use your discretion, but certainly if it's about using technology, an answer from 10 years ago may not be relevant.
Can I just add to that and say that I think that if you are honest and say, you know, to be honest with you, my best answer to this question is from a long time ago, and, you know, blah, 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 whatever it was. But the reason I want to use that example is because the lesson I learned from that is something that I have carried with me throughout my career, and I have used what I learned in blah, blah, blah. Do you see what I mean? So if you can perhaps use that example, but kind of bring in the learning from it and show that that has shaped how you have developed during your career, I think it would be very relevant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so finally, leave a lasting impression. And as Lisa said, it's not the impression that during the interview your child asked if they needed, or told you they needed to go for a wee, but it's a lasting impression about you. Now, obviously, if you're doing a face-to-face interview, you can stand up, you can shake hands with somebody. Well, maybe we won't be able to in the future, but we did used to be able to do that. But leave a lasting impression in terms of maybe the final questions that you ask. Lisa said about smile, you know, make sure that you look approachable, amenable, and also summarize and explain why they should consider you, but do that fairly succinctly. Also agree a call to action. Now, they may tell you, you will hear from us in the next few days or whatever, but you can also summarize, you know, if they ask for testimonials, references, then you will say, I will get those to you in the next within 24 hours, 48 hours. If they don't say when they will contact you, ask the question, how long is it likely to be until I hear from you? It's okay to do that. And they might say, well, we're interviewing several other candidates. It will be at the end of next week and so on. But you want to make sure that you leave a lasting impression and they don't forget you as someone that they interviewed. I'm now going to pass over to Lisa, who's going to talk about who is hiring. So I hope all the points that we've discussed will help you going forward, but it is important to consider who is hiring.
Thanks, Fiona. Just to add on to your last point, actually, I would really recommend people following up via email with your interviewer, just saying, thanks very much for your time. You know, I've enjoyed the interview, and I look forward to hearing from you. It might just make you stand out against the other candidates. Sorry, back to you, Lisa.
Sorry, that's a really good point, Esme. And yeah, I should have said that. I think it's a really good point.
Also on that, I've heard quite a few stories of people who weren't successful at interview, but because they kept in touch with the people that had interviewed them, the person that they did choose for the job fell through, and they went back to that person and offered them the job. So it can actually pay to keep in touch and to be a communicative person.
I think that's a good point, because also, even if it isn't for that particular job, if you've left a lasting, really good impression, they might say, oh, actually, we've got another job coming up, and that person would be a good fit for that job. We'll consider them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, if they've invested, you know, some interview processes can, you know, you can be interviewed perhaps, you know, 10 or more times. So they will have interviewed, you know, they will have invested quite a lot of time in you, especially if you've got down to, you know, the kind of last stage, and you know, that's time that they've invested, and so, you know, to waste it would be a shame. So as Fiona says, if they can recommend you for another job in another area, that will be something that is quite common. Anyway, onto this slide, who is hiring? Now, you're going to hear later from some employers who are going to talk about the landscape, and you're also going to hear from a recruitment professional who's going to talk about who she is looking to place people on behalf of. So hopefully you'll get a lot of good information as the day goes on. But broadly speaking, you know, logistics and supply chain roles, you know, Amazon are very heavily hiring at the moment. They've had a number of online events. So if you're interested in Amazon, then do look out for those events. The public sector still needs to keep going and keep providing services to people. And there are a lot of jobs being advertised widely in that area. Cybersecurity is something that has you know, become a huge area of concern due in the current climate, with more and more organisations having to operate remote working. So, you know, cyber is something that they are really companies are really looking to strengthen. So anyone offering those kind of services is very active at the moment. Utilities, you'll hear from Thames Water later. BT has been mentioned. All of those organisations, and it's not just technical roles. You don't have to be a telecom specialist. There are obviously other roles, and similarly with healthcare. Clearly the NHS is a huge priority at the moment, but it's not all about being a clinical specialist. There are a huge raft of program management roles, and also managerial roles. And also a lot of kind of technology project management roles. The NHS is rolling out a lot of kind of electronic patient record programs throughout their trusts, and they need people to deliver that and to ensure that those go smoothly. So a lot of good roles there. Transport and infrastructure, another obvious one. If those areas are things that interest you, I would say those are quite buoyant at the moment. However, I would say that in any kind of crisis scenario, any company that needs to hire will try to keep things going and try to keep doing that. We've seen a number of roles advertised on our jobs board that seem fairly unlikely. For example, recently there was the Deputy Chief Executive to the Union Jack Club. Now, you might have thought that, in that kind of hospitality type sector, that things wouldn't be moving forward, but they were. They have interviewed for that role and placed a person. So even the OA, we have been hiring during this situation, and jobs have appeared on our jobs board for that. So I think within financial services, within professional services, there are jobs out there. That there's probably not the volume that there have been, but if your heart is set on these things, then don't lose hope, because sectors are trying to get back to normal. A lot of people have been asking a lot of questions about the military internship programs, and we're working with those organisations to understand when they hope things will be back to normal. But I think the hope across all sectors is that things will get back to normal. And how are they doing this? Well, they're running virtual events. We've touched on people like Amazon, but Deloitte have had a virtual event this week, and virtual interviews are being conducted all the time. And actually, I've even heard reports of face-to-face interviews now beginning to take place, obviously with social distancing being observed. So I think things are moving in that area. But here to talk about onboarding processes, I'll let Fiona introduce Andy.
Yeah, we're going to hand over to Andy Brown, who's transformation manager, a former army officer, who's going to talk about the onboarding process. And Andy, I hope you throw some light on this, because I have heard of people who started a job and they haven't even gone into the office. They've just been delivered a laptop and then have to get on with it. So hope you can make things clear for our clients, Andy.
Sure, thank you, Fiona. And I'm one of those people, actually. So I'm Andy Brown. I started at Shaw Trust just after lockdown at the beginning of April. And for people who don't know Shaw Trust, it's not surprising, because I always say it's one of the largest charities that people have never heard of. They are a registered charity. They do a lot of good work supporting people with learning disabilities, with physical disabilities, who are struggling in life, in work, supporting them to gain education, enter work, develop their careers further, improve their well-being, basically rebuild their lives. All under the radar of a lot of government contracts and under the auspices of working with partners. So yeah, a fantastic cause with a great deal of purpose. But I started, say, at the end of beginning of April, just as we went into lockdown. I was fortunate enough that I did meet the chief exec and the chief operating officer, two people I've been working closely with prior to lockdown, but we hadn't sort of discussed roles and offers until we'd gone into lockdown. And I just wanted to sort of talk through a couple of things. Most of it's obvious around what's the expectation, what's the reality from my perspective, what I've experienced. What does the build-up look like? What does day one look like? What does week one look like? And perhaps some of the practical challenges, and indeed psychological challenges with onboarding whilst in lockdown. And I say this is just my story. I'm sure there's others who have got different stories, similar themes, perhaps other contributions to make. And I think, yeah, as we all know, we're living in a different world. We're living in different times. That doesn't necessarily mean we should expect things to be completely different or indeed lower standards. As I think Fiona was talking about and Lisa was talking about interviews, there is a certain amount of etiquette and expectation about onboarding that you can expect, but the reality is there'll be challenges with that, both positive and indeed negative. I said I physically met a couple of my key stakeholders, but I appreciate that in the times we live in, we're doing remote interviews. You could get an offer and start work without actually having physically met someone in that organisation, or indeed gone into the building, the offices, the sites, etc., etc. And that was my case. I haven't visited one of Shaw Trust sites or venues. I've only met a handful of people through those discussions. And I think it emphasises what we, I think, are good at as ex-officers in the military, is being self-starters. You have to be proactive in that space. And this will run through a couple of things that I'll say in the next few minutes. A lot of this is common sense and obvious, but I don't think there's any harm in stating the obvious. So before day one, the build-up, I think I still had those sort of nervous feelings about starting a new job, as I'm sure we all have, a bit of sort of anxiety and trepidation about what that might look like. Are you going to live up to the expectation you sold at interview on those discussions? Those usual concerns and questions, perhaps slightly exaggerated by the uncertain times we live in. I've heard of people being let down at the last minute with redundancy programs and roles being taken off the table, and people being furloughed, and all that anxiety goes with the build-up, as you would expect in starting a new job in the days and weeks beforehand. But there's no real difference, I think. The lesson for me was to keep on engaging, keep the lines of communication open, keep talking to your new employer and indeed your new boss, if that's been identified, to keep the engagement going and that interaction. And so for me, day one came along. By this stage, I'd had my laptop couriered to me. I'd had a very basic Nokia phone couriered to me, and not much else. And I don't mean that to sound disparaging of the organisation. I had phoned up the IT department, which was the only contact number I had, to see how I logged on to my laptop, and I was met with the response, so you're not on the system yet. So that was fine. Day one, I sat there thinking, well, I must be on the system now. So I phoned up the IT department again and said, look, it's day one. Unfortunately enough, I was on the system, and they told me how to log into my laptop. So there are sort of practical challenges there, which I'll talk about in a second. But the expectation is very different, because you're not necessarily given a time and a place and a person to meet up with on day one as you would if you walk into the office. I started jobs before where you turn up at 9 o'clock at this office and be expected and met by this person, and then taken into this team or this floor, and the rest is history for that first day to get you onboarded, to get the admin done, to start understanding the role and meeting the team. And none of that happens when you're in lockdown. You do that from your study or your kitchen or your lounge or wherever you seem to be working. And that comes back to being the self-starter, because you have to go and hunt a lot of that down. And also, I found myself sat there on day one waiting for my first email. Sounds a bit bizarre, but you started with a blank sheet, because you don't necessarily have that onboarding program given to you all mapped out nicely like a timetable as to what that program looks like in week one. Now, it could be better, and we should expect better, but people are busy. People are being focused on a lot of other things right now. Doesn't mean you're forgotten, but I think it's, for both employers and employees, really something to think long and hard about as to why should it be any different just because we're on lockdown. Week one, again, shouldn't feel or look any different. But again, it started for me to take shape as I was introducing myself to people virtually, over Skype. We use Teams, over other video mediums, just to get to know people. You're doing that sort of two-dimensional conversation where you're just seeing the person at the other end of the video call. You're inviting them into your property as well, which is slightly unusual on day one, week one, when you don't really know people. But again, we just need to be comfortable with that and get out and about as you would if you're in an office space or a workspace. You would walk the floor, so to speak. There's nothing wrong with doing that virtually by putting yourself out there and sending an introductory email to say, hey, I'm new here, can we have a chat? There's nothing wrong with having a virtual coffee chat, as I have done with some people, and have a half an hour call with people to understand what they do over a cup of coffee. It sounds bizarre, but it's another way of getting to know people in a slightly more relaxed environment rather than a formal programmed, scheduled meeting with an agenda. And it gives you an opportunity. You still can't get away from the basics, from all the compliance stuff, the onboarding stuff that you'd expect in any organisation. It gives you an opportunity to actually do that remotely in the quiet of your own home with fewer distractions, and just put that to one side so it's done as soon as possible rather than it dragging on. The two things I really want to surface are the practical challenges, and I put here the psychological challenges. There are some practical challenges, laptops being couriered, understanding what your logon details are, basics of working from home anyway, about connectivity. Do you have the right phone coverage in the place where you're choosing to work? Knowing who's who in an organisation, how you find that out, because it's not necessarily spoon-fed to you. But again, going back to what I said at the start, as officers, as retired officers, we don't necessarily get used to being spoon-fed, which is a good thing because you go out and hunt the information. But some of the practical answers that you get, perhaps you could ask someone in the office, how do I do this? How do I access the intranet for the organisation? Where do I find the HR details? You have to kind of work out yourself. You can still text, Skype, message people, but sometimes it's quicker just to hunt around yourself and get used to that, because you haven't got that person across the office to ask for assistance. The psychological challenges, I think this goes hand in hand with remote working anyway. I got a sense in the first couple of days of a little bit of isolation, that I was on my own. I knew I wasn't, because I had people I could reach out to, but you're sat there thinking, well, what am I expected to do in the first day or so when it is relatively quiet? But then you remind yourself, actually, in the first couple of days of a new job, it can be quiet as you get your feet under the table. There's not much expectation. There's not much expected from you in those first days because you're new on the block. But then it soon ramps up. And that's an opportunity to do all the stuff I talked about, the mandatory stuff, get to know the organisation, get to know the systems, and use that wisely. There's no floor walking. Sounds obvious, but there's no sort of walking past the water cooler or making a coffee and bumping into people, introducing yourself. You have to do it in a more deliberate way because you're not physically in the office. It sounds obvious, it is obvious, but don't underestimate that side. Similarly, there are no introductions other than when you first meet someone on a virtual call, but no one says, oh, hey, come with me and let me introduce you to so-and-so who you might need to talk to. That's all done by recommendations that you need to go and have a call with someone, or you join a meeting and the introductions are made there virtually. I don't have a team in Shore Trust, but I can only imagine the challenges if you're leading a team or a team member and fitting into that as soon as possible. You would normally be welcome. There might be a social occasion on the first couple of days. You might be taken for lunch to get to know people. Again, you won't have that opportunity. So you just need to think about what that might look and feel like. And the whole thing about how to fit in, how to build rapport, how to use those social media tools to break through sort of the cultural side of getting to know people. We all have that challenge when we're working virtually, indeed, like this kind of event, where normally we'd be in a venue, we'd be networking over coffee, we'd be meeting people, we'd be eyeballing people. You just have to think slightly differently about how do you build the same rapport virtually over Teams, Zoom, whatever system you're using. I think on the plus side for me, just to sum up, it's about being self-confident, and I think we from the military have that in bucket loads, and that's not about being overconfident. It's about being self-confident with who you are and putting yourself out there like a networking event to get to know people. The other, it sounds cliche to say, but the resilience, the dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, they all come to the fore in onboarding remotely, where you are trying to get yourself set up and settled into a new organisation in a new role. And these things, I think, stand us in great stead. And I think the other point I would say is, be curious and be over inquisitive, because you have to search for information, you have to ask the questions, you have to make yourself known, but do it in such a manner that you're not ruffling feathers. Do it in a manner that you're introducing yourself. You're the new person in the team. People would have been told to expect you, but they won't necessarily see you, if that makes sense, because you're not in the office. People can't see you walking down the corridor or see you by the water cooler. And I think, this is the new norm. It's not necessarily full time. I think in the future we may have the occasional office visits, but I think we can expect this not to go away. I think there's some lessons that I can draw from this when I'm onboarding someone in this environment, and I think there's some lessons that every organisation will be able to share to continue to make it a positive experience.
Thank you, Andy. That's excellent, and some really, really positive advice there. I'm glad to hear your new job is going so well. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions right now. So what would be the best way for people to follow up with you? Would that be via LinkedIn or?
Yes, more than happy via LinkedIn. Please, as we also do on LinkedIn, if you want to connect with me, please do so. Please just add a quick line as to what it's about and why you'd like to connect. Not that I get hundreds and thousands of requests. It just helps. It helps position the rapport. But more than happy for people to connect with me on LinkedIn.